Good morning. How's everybody doing today so far? That's good. The scripture reading this morning will be from the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. That's Proverbs 3, verses 1 to 12. My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you prosperity. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruit of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves, as a father the son he delights in. And the human writer of this passage was Solomon, king of Israel. If they were asked, many people, maybe even most people, would probably say if they had their choice, they would like to be rich and famous. In the past, we had TV shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. I don't know if anybody remembers that show, that showed how wealthy people live. Their extravagant mansions with ornate furnishings, and their pools and tennis courts, and their expensive clothes, jewelry, cars, yachts, planes, and whatever else you can think of. This show was popular because a lot of people want to see how the rich live lives of luxury, because they wish they could have that kind of life for themselves. Today we have different lotteries with chances to win expensive prizes, houses or expensive cars or multi-million-dollar payouts. And there are places like Las Vegas and all the gambling casinos that have sprung up all over the place in recent years that cater to the desire in people to get rich. But maybe if we could all become rich and famous for a while, we might change our minds about wanting this for ourselves. Maybe we would see that it really isn't all it's cracked up to be, that there are potential negatives that go along with it. And I think we would probably see, especially spiritually and in our relationship with God, that we would experience more and different temptations and problems in our lives. Now, for the last quite a while, like a few months, Dean has been preaching from the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And Solomon, king of Israel, wrote most of the Proverbs, and he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. So today I thought I would preach on Solomon, the man in his life. In his day, he was world famous and the richest person on earth. And I believe that if we could ask Solomon today, that he would say being rich and famous can cause some problems in our walk with God. So this morning I would like us to look briefly at Solomon and his life to see if we can learn some truths from God's word that we can apply personally to ourselves in our lives today that can help us in our spiritual walk with our God. Now God appeared and spoke to Solomon at three different points in his life with three different messages. I'd like to look at those this morning. And the first is in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 to 14. 1 Kings 3, verses 5 to 14. We're going to be in 1 Kings quite a bit today, especially in the first part of the lesson, so you want to keep your finger there or whatever. And this is what I call the promises. 1 Kings 3, beginning in verse 5. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment and administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life." So there we have the God first appearing to Solomon, and he promises to bless him. And God tells Solomon he will give him whatever he asks for. And of course, Solomon makes a wise choice and asks for wisdom, for a discerning heart to govern God's people and to distinguish between right and wrong. And God is pleased and promises to give Solomon what he asked for, a wise and discerning heart like no mere human being ever had or ever will have. Also, God says he will give Solomon riches and honor so that in his lifetime he'll have no equal among kings. And if we read a little bit, go on reading further in 1 Kings, we see that God keeps his promises to Solomon. He gave him great wisdom and discernment and great wealth and honor. Example of this is again in chapter 3, picking it up in verse 15, where Solomon demonstrates great wisdom in his ruling to settle a dispute between two prostitutes over a baby. 1 Kings 3:16-28. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, "My lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the 2 of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born." The other woman said, "No, the living one is my son. The dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine." And so they argued before the king. The king said, "This one says, my son is alive and your son is dead. Well, that one says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive." And then the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, "Cut the living child in 2 and give half to one and half to the other." The woman whose son was alive was filled with compassion for her son and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." But the other said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in 2. Then the king gave his ruling, "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is the mother." When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. So the people of Israel were in awe of King Solomon's wisdom because of this ruling that he made, because they saw that his wisdom was from God. And so God is giving him what he asked for, great wisdom. And we see the description of Solomon's wisdom in chapter 4, verses 29-34. 1 Kings 4:29-34. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the men of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. That he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish, Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. So we see that God made Solomon the wisest man in the world. His fame spread to all the surrounding nations. All the kings of the world heard of his wisdom, and they sent men from all their nations to come and listen to him, to the wisdom that he spoke. Because it says God had given Solomon, quote, a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Verse 29. When the Queen of Sheba came to visit, she says she was overwhelmed by Solomon's wisdom, wealth, and achievements. She'd heard about him, but he said it's way more than I heard of. She couldn't believe it. The wealth that he had and all that he had done and the great wisdom that he had. But he was not only wise, he was also really rich. 1 Kings 10, verses 14 and 15. 1 Kings 10, verses 14 and 15. It says, the weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the land. So Solomon's yearly income was 666 talents, which is about 25 tons of gold, which equates to 50,000 pounds or 800,000 ounces of gold. Now I looked up the price of gold, the closing price on Friday, and US dollars, $1,645.70 per ounce. Canadian dollars, $2,238.40 per ounce. So Solomon received in today's dollars a little over $1.3 billion US, or just under $1.8 billion Canadian US per year. And this did not include the revenues from merchants, traders, all the Arabian kings, and the governors of the land, which when added would have made Solomon's income much higher than those figures. So Solomon had a multi-billion-dollar annual income. So he indeed was the richest person in the world. So obviously God had kept his promises and blessed Solomon with everything he said he would give him. 1 Kings 10, 21 to 25. It says, all King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. The king had a fleet of trading ships at sea along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years it returned carrying gold, silver, ivory, and apes and baboons. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons and spices, and horses and mules. So God had blessed him with everything that he said he would. Now we have come to the second time when God appeared to Solomon to speak to him, which I call the warning. God appeared to Solomon and spoke to him a second time about 20 years later, after he had completed the Lord's temple and his own palace. 1 Kings 9, verses 1 to 9. When Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord in the royal palace and had achieved all he had desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. The Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. As I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all nations, among all peoples. And though this temple is now imposing, all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, "Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple?" People will answer, "Because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them." So we see that God promises to establish Solomon's throne forever on the condition that he live with integrity, uprightness, and obedience to all his commands, like his father David had done. And then God warns that unfaithfulness, disobedience, and idolatry, worshiping and serving the false gods of the pagans around them, by Solomon or his sons, will result in Israel being cut off from the promised land, and that God would reject and destroy the temple that bears his name. So God must have seen a change in Solomon's heart and sin in his life. So what were Solomon's sins? What did he do in disobedience to God's commands? Well, if we want to turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, where we see the regulations for the king, which is part of the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to 20. Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to 20. God says, "When you enter the land the Lord your God has given you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, 'Let us set a king over us like all the nations around us,' be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests who are Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel." So we see some of the regulations that God has set forth for them having a king. The first thing is that the king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. Solomon disobeyed this command. In 1 Kings 10 and 1 Kings chapter 4, also several passages in 2 Chronicles, we see that he accumulated 12,000 horses, and he imported many of them from Egypt, in direct violation of God's will. It also says the king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. And Solomon paid no attention to this command. 1 Kings 11, verses 1 to 8. 1 Kings 11, verses 1 to 8. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. So, again, Solomon disobeyed God. he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray and turned his heart after other so-called gods as he grew old, just as God had warned would happen. Solomon was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, and he did not follow God completely. So he did evil in the eyes of the Lord with his immorality and idolatry. And apparently Solomon grew to love his wives more than the Lord, and became more concerned with pleasing them than his God. The third command of God was the king must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Obviously, from what we see, Solomon broke this command big time. He had a lot of silver and gold for himself. And the fourth thing that God says, that at the beginning of his reign, the king was to write for himself a copy of the law of Moses, keep it with him, and read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord and follow carefully all God's commands. This was to prevent the king from considering himself better than his fellow Israelites and turning away from the law of God. If the king was faithful in doing this, then he and his descendants would reign a long time over Israel. Now Solomon wrote Psalms 72 and 127, most of the Proverbs, and the books of Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs. So although he wrote much of the books of wisdom in the Old Testament, it is apparent that he failed to obey this command. Solomon did not revere God, and he did not follow carefully all of his law. He turned away from the Lord and his commands, and it seems he did consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and became filled with pride over his achievements. It's interesting that it took Solomon 7 years to build God's temple, but it took him 13 years to build his own palace. Almost twice as long. 1 Kings 10, we have verses 18 to 20, we have the description of the throne Solomon had made for himself. 1 Kings 10, verses 18 to 20. Then the king made a great throne inlaid with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and its back had a rounded top. On both sides of the seat were armrests with a lion standing beside each of them. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at either end of each step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. Can you imagine that? 6 steps to get to the top, and then that'd be 14 lions carved of ivory and overlaid with pure gold. Nothing like this throne had ever been made for any other kingdom. Now perhaps this is an indication that Solomon's fame and fortune and power and glory had gone to his head, and he had started believing that he had achieved what he did by his own wisdom and strength. Solomon fulfilled the requirements of the law of Moses for sacrifices and all the religious festivals. He was very generous in his offerings to God. 1 Kings 3 and verse 4 says Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings to the Lord at Gibeon. In 1 Kings 8 and verse 5, when the Ark of the Covenant was brought up to the finished temple, Solomon and the people sacrificed, quote, so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. And 1 Kings 8, verses 62 and 63, at the dedication of the completed temple, says that Solomon sacrificed 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. Maybe he thought that the abundance of his sacrifices would make up for his unfaithfulness and disobedience to God. But as God told King Saul in 1 Samuel 15, he delights in obedience more than burnt offerings and sacrifices. To God, obedience is better than sacrifice. Obedience is more important than the outer form of our worship. So it seems that Solomon was going through the motions of all the outward rituals, but his heart was not completely devoted to God. Even while he worshiped the Lord, he also worshiped the false gods of all his foreign wives. That brings us to God's third appearance to Solomon when he spoke to him, and what I call the judgment. 1 Kings 11, verses 9 to 13. 1 Kings 11, verses 9 to 13. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David, your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." So God became angry with Solomon because he had turned away from him in his heart. The Lord had directly forbidden Solomon from following other gods, but he disobeyed God's command. So because of Solomon's unfaithfulness and disobedience in turning away from God to practice pagan idolatry, the Lord vows to tear the kingdom away from his son and give it to one who served under Solomon. God would take away all but one tribe from Solomon's kingdom. But actually, when you read, it was actually two tribes. Judah and Benjamin were often counted together as one and referred to as Judah. So there were 12 tribes in Israel. Jeroboam ends up, if you read further, gets 10 tribes in the north. And Rehoboam, Solomon's son, got one, which is actually two. It's counted as one, Judah and Benjamin. But anyway, this judgment of God would come because of Solomon's sins that came from his disobedient attitude toward God. So what happened to Solomon? Why did he turn away from God and fall into sin? It's sometimes hard to believe that the same man wrote many of the Proverbs, like Proverbs 3, verses 5 to 7. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. In 1 Corinthians 8, and verse 1, the Apostle Paul says, knowledge puffs up. In other words, great knowledge can give a person a swelled head, puffed up with pride. And I believe this is what happened to Solomon. I believe Solomon's wisdom, his great knowledge and understanding of this world, caused him to get a swelled head over all his accomplishments and to stop trusting in God and start trusting in himself. Solomon himself wrote Proverbs 16, verse 18, that says, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." I believe this is what happened to him. It appears that he fell in love with his wealth and power, which caused him to want more and more, and which led to his downfall. 1 Timothy 6, verses 9 and 10. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. Paul speaks about this when he writes, "People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." I think what this says may apply to Solomon. Many of Solomon's marriages to foreign women were to daughters of kings in order to form alliances and acquire more trading partners, and in this way to continue to increase his wealth and power. He had 700 wives of royal birth, and that's usually what that was about, to create more alliances and more trade and bring in more wealth for the people, the countries involved. Because of his great riches and fame, Solomon over the years became more and more worldly and less godly. He was seduced by his power and glory and the splendor of his kingdom, and by the sensual gratification of all his pleasures. And although Solomon had great wisdom when he spoke 3,000 proverbs, many of which are recorded in the scriptures, he still failed in many ways to do the will of God. Although he was the wisest man in the world and he knew the scriptures, Solomon was still unfaithful to God, and he turned away from him and fell into sin. The cause of Solomon's fall was that he knew it, but he didn't do it because of his pride. James 1, 22 to 25. James chapter 1, verses 22 to 25. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in the mirror, and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does. Here James emphasizes the importance and necessity of wholehearted and humble obedience to the Word of God in order to be right with God and be blessed by Him. Doing all the right things outwardly in our worship without obedience to God in our daily life is unacceptable to Him. Being the smartest person in the world is not enough to please God. We could have a doctorate in theology and be a brilliant Bible scholar and know the scriptures inside out, and that would not make us right with God. Knowing the truth of God's word is very important and necessary, but it's not enough. Having all the right doctrine and the right form of worship is not enough. Solomon was the wisest man on earth, and he knew the scriptures, and he even wrote some of them by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But because he didn't obey what he knew, God was angry with him, and he tore the kingdom away. Now, as an old man near the end of his life, Solomon came to the right conclusion about what matters most in our lives in this world and what gives us real meaning and hope in this life and for the next. And that's the last two verses of the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. Where he sums it all up. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is our whole duty. This is our reason for being. This is why we're here in this world, to obey God and please him and serve him and bring him glory. So let's all learn from Solomon's example and live what we learn and do what we know from God's word. We need to love God with our whole heart and show our love by humbly obeying and serving him in order to be accepted and blessed by our God. If we can help you or serve you in any way, we can pray for you or study scriptures or help you physically in any way, please let somebody in the church know so we can help you. Thank you.